Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
This is part 2 of section 8 in Jordan Wood's series of lectures. We have one more in the series. But in this, Jordan begins to answer questions about basic resources for patristics, for philosophy, and then he does a rather long comparison between Hegel and Maximus that is quite insightful, and discusses then the key turn that occurs in both Hegel and Maximus in regard to the relationship between time and eternity. We hope you're enjoying these podcasts with Jordan Wood, and we're looking forward to, we have 2 upcoming classes. Our course with Jonathan Heaps will start on February 16th, and it will run then through April 11th. And you can register if you go to Forging Plowshares course offerings, and the course is now open for registration. The course will run for 8 weeks, and we will meet once a week. There is material in the course in addition, but we will decide then at the beginning of the course the best day for everyone to meet together. We're also going to be offering a class, a more basic class in sin and salvation, just an introduction to the theological catalog, touching upon all of the key issues of basic theology and how the issues then are seen in light of a nonviolent atonement. We are a donation-based ministry dependent upon the goodwill of those who may benefit from what we're doing. So as we enter this new year, we are looking to expand our support base, and we would hope that if you're benefiting from what we're doing, that you would express that. I hope you enjoy then this part 2 with Jordan Daniel Wood on the relation between Hegel and Maximus.
It's Maximus maybe who's pulling a lot of these ideas together, but I've been, as you're going through, I'm trying to jot down all these other names who are sort of dipping in and dipping out and maybe not getting the full picture. I had a question that was kind of looking backwards because I don't have any patristics understanding. I don't know if you have any suggestions for just like a good intro to, what's the philosophical underpinnings of patristic thought, or even just of Maximus's thought. Like I got my origin written down, and I've got Aristotle, although I wasn't really sure where to dip in for him. So that would be the one part, is sort of like looking backwards, and then the other part looking forwards is I did read Hegel in my PhD studies in Romanticism, and I do think there's probably all sorts of connections between folks like Hegel and Blake and other folks like that. I'd be curious to hear what are the differences between Hegel and Maximus in terms of their understanding of synthesis. Just choose one question if that's too many, though. So,
well, no, we'll go with it. I just remind me if I forget or leave something out. Yeah. Thanks, Jeff. I didn't know you had done PhD studies in Romanticism. That's awesome. We should be hearing from you. So, in terms of like the kind of patristic background stuff, I'm going to be kind of a little annoying and say like, well, it depends on what aspect you're interested in. So, I'll throw out a few suggestions. If you're interested just in kind of like a nice introduction to I almost want to say the feel. That's very vague, but like the feel of the patristic, especially like way of understanding scripture and stuff like that. I've always thought that Robert Wilkins' book, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, is very nice little entree, into some of that. He's got bigger books too, like The First 1,000 Years and stuff. But so The Spirit of Early Christian Thought is good for just getting into that. If you're more interested in the philosophical background, oh man. So I would I'm so partial to like primary sources, but I realize it's not very helpful sometimes, not manageable. So like for me, just to throw out there just for fun, why not? If I was going to give you like a list of let's say 5 or 7 primary sources. It's like kind of necessity. I would say Plato's Phaedo along with the Apology is probably where I would go there. And then the other thing I want to throw in there, it just doesn't get enough play in my opinion, is shoot, what's the dialogue about knowledge? What's scientific knowledge? I'll get back to you on that one. It's great because I love that text because it actually ends in like he goes through like 10 different definitions of episteme, and they all fail, of course. Like it normally happens to dialogues, but actually, it's interesting to me. And nobody hardly ever notes what the last way that the last one fails. It's not the Meno. That one's on virtue.
Oh, right.
Although that one's yes, Theaetetus. Yeah, somebody said that right. Yeah, Theaetetus. What's so interesting about the Theaetetus is that the last way it fails is basically by what I would call an instance of interpersonal knowledge. I don't see anyone ever discuss that, but it's like the last definition, the most refined definition they get, it seems to cover all the bases, but then the one example someone gives is like the recognizing someone coming on the horizon and to see whether or not you know who they are, and it doesn't like fit the definition. So, and then they just stops. Like there's no like resolution, which I always, of course, with my biases, I'm always like reading all into that, like, oh my God, look, they were on the brink or whatever. Anyway, so I think those 3 would be good. Aristotle, I would not counsel just plowing through Aristotle. I would say I actually found that the Nicomachean Ethics are useful on this, but actually, but before that, I would say On the Soul. It's short. You even get some of the scientific method in there. I would say On the Soul, Nicomachean Ethics, and then I want to throw in there the Prior Analytics, the Organon. I also would suggest, if you're jumping ahead, Plotinus. And Plotinus's Aeneids, and the ones that I think are most useful are 5-1, 4-2, 5-1, 6-4 and 5, and 6-8 and 9. Those are, I think, the best views of Plotinus. I took a course on him. And then I would say Nemesius's On Human Nature. It's a nice English translation of it. It's a little pricey though, but it's a nice edition. Maximus uses sometimes just swaths from that in like Ambiguum 10. But Nemesius was widely read. He's not particularly brilliant in my opinion, but he does bring a lot of strands and kind of makes them readable, digestible, and gives you a nice glimpse into that, like the way they view the world and the human being and all that. So that's probably sufficient for like philosophical background. There's Stephen R.L. Clark is really good on just general antiquity. I've always found Lloyd Garrison's book on Neoplatonisms. I thought that was good. R something Wallace. I think he's got a book just called Neoplatonism. It's like 150 pages, very useful. It's like kind of a classic. It might be outdated in ways, but it's classic. And then if you read French, there's even more that I think are good. That's some of the philosophical background. But then you also asked about Hegel, right? Thanks, Jeff. Hegel, the ways that they differ. I think there's definitely ways that they differ. I definitely, like I've said this about a million times, but I pretty much half or 3/4 the way done writing my book before I even really read Hegel. It was only because I had somebody who was sort of anti-Hegelian be like, wow, that sounds like Hegel. And I'm like, oh, shoot, I should probably figure out what that means, and like fend off these. Like I went in to read Hegel in order to fend off objections. I wasn't like going in to find support or whatever. In fact, I was predisposed to thinking the common narrative among theologians who more or less want to, I think, basically avoid most of modern philosophy, I think, post-Kant, is that they would say, well, the late Schelling kind of returns us back to a more classical theist view, kind of like gets us back behind Kant, even though he sort of knows Kant well. And so it's almost like the late Schelling becomes an excuse to ignore Hegel and all the other parts of Schelling and Fichte and the rest of them, and Kant himself. I think that's a basic mistake. I'm translating the late Schelling right now, and I have to say people are going to be sorely disappointed if that's their expectation. Schelling is so close to Hegel. It's unbelievable. It's not the same. He's incorporating myth more. There's an emphasis on freedom that is a little different, but it's the distance between the late Schelling and Hegel compared to the distance between those two and like most anyone else that I know is negligible. But the differences are this. Well, first I'm going to start with the analogs because I do think they're important, and then look at some disanalogs. One thing that I think is similar between them is the emphasis on Christ at the center. I mean, of course, and that you only think through spirit and you think through the Trinity through Christ. And that's actually a really crucial point. There's a lot of books out there and studies, mostly critical of Hegel. And what they'll do is jump straight to his Trinitarian theology as they read it. And then they'll be like, this is heterodox. This is not the Trinity that Christians believe. But they've skipped the crucial move, which is through Christ. There is no Trinity without Christ. So you can't really do Trinitarian theology in isolation from Christology without doing so artificially. And so I think people miss the kind of radicality of Maximus of Hegel's Christology in and of itself as he then applies it to everything, not just the Trinity. And so by the time they jump to the Trinity, they're going to think it's like, well, he gets accused of literally everything in opposite directions, modalism in one way, a Joachimite, sort of three ages, almost tritheism in another way. It's all just nonsense. Get beyond the slogans. Don't read any of that, and instead just read Hegel and then see what you think yourself. It's just too convoluted, the discussions around it now, in my opinion. So it's funny because people ask me about secondary literature on Hegel, and I don't know it that well anymore because I just ignore it mostly, except Julian Rose, who's too good. So the similarity would be there. Trinity, like thinking God through Christ. Not that you can artificially do that. Of course, you have a conception of God prior to thinking of Christ as well. I mean, it's both directions. But I think that's a similarity. I think too there is a weird historical analog that most people don't notice, which is that if you follow out the Neoplatonist tradition, especially past Iamblichus and Proclus in the 4th, 5th century, and you get to someone like Damascius in the 6th century, man, what you get in Damascius is like he's like the last, by the way, he's like the last teacher of the school in Athens before it was shut down by Christians. It's extremely what we call negative philosophy, very apathetic. Like you shouldn't even call God a cause. God is related to nothing, and a cause posits a relation with an effect and all this stuff. So God is not even the cause of the world. Bulgakov says that, of course, right? But so what's interesting though is I think there is a kind of like what Damascius is to the Neoplatonic tradition, and by proxy, then the whole late antique and late antique Greek philosophical tradition. Kant is to medievalism and the early modern philosophy. So what's interesting is you got Maximus after that path of Neoplatonism has traveled, which is analogous to the path that scholasticism, late medieval philosophy through nominalism and all that sort of disintegrates in the early modern and the Protestant Reformation. That path has been walked all the way to Kant, to where you get to, oh, lo and behold, guess what? Kant thinks you can't know anything about God. Totally inaccessible to us. Doctrines and dogmas about God are unintelligible, and they're actually sadly unintelligible. The modern inflection for Kant is that the main reason people don't appreciate this, and I think it's actually something to appreciate about him, even though I'm not a Kantian. Ultimately, Kant isn't just out to like deconstruct people's faith. I mean, he's not out to just be like, I'm going to be a critic. He thinks, and if you look in his context, you can see why he would think this. He thinks the sooner we can realize that things like the Trinity and Christology, the incarnation, the soul, the afterlife, these are not matters of knowledge, theoretical knowledge that can be resolved rationally, but those things are totally inaccessible to reason and therefore cannot be resolved by persuasion. The sooner we'll get ourselves out of the constant cycle of killing each other and going to war and doing violence to one another because we can't resolve these disputes. His is a plea for peace. And so he as he says in the preface to the first critique, I had to deny knowledge of God to make room for faith. That's what he says. It's a little bit, I think, he's a pietist, so actually probably sort of more personally true to him than those of us that want more of a dogmatic tradition would say. That is kind of what they thought. So, but you see the socio-political kind of upshot of all that, right? We can stop the wars of religion and Europe tearing itself apart if you just stop thinking someone is not only wrong, but hell-bound or could be dragging other people to hell because of what they say about the Trinity. I have to say, I think in that regard, Kant has more or less won the day. because that's all of our defaults. Even if you don't like it or you don't agree with it or you're resisting it, you do live in a world where most people think that what you and I have been discussing these 8 weeks would not be matters to kill each other over, right? In the same way as, maybe some other, scientific thing that has massive ramifications practically or something. So that's Kant's project, but it is true that the price of that project is to deny that you can know God. And this is the thing that so-called post-Kantian idealists, not so much Fichte, but especially Schelling, Hölderlin, you throw him in there, the poet, who's also a real philosopher in his own right, and Hegel oppose, 100% oppose. They think if we can't know God, then, as Hegel colorfully puts it, I think I've said this to you already, but we would be better off as cattle who, though they can't see the stars in the sky, also don't look up at them. Who they can't know that they don't know they're there. It's almost like it'd be better if we can't know God, it'd be better not to know that we don't even know God. We should just be beasts, and George don't. Yeah, exactly. So the question becomes, how can we know God and God remain God in our knowing him? Because aren't you finite? Isn't it everything you know, every object of knowledge that you possess or grasp, as we say, or understand or comprehend, doesn't that just mean the thing is bounded by finite limits? And you've attained them. And in fact, you transcended those limits, which is why you can then, quote, offer an account. That is to say, you can narrate from beginning to end how things go, how they relate, right? And so Kant, of course, as you well know, Jeff, I'm not teaching anything, because if you do romanticism, I mean, that's also a response to Kant in part, right? I mean, you would probably be able to tell us better than I can. They kind of presuppose Kant's right about a lot of things to make some of the moves that they do, right? They just, as I understand it, here you'd have to teach me, but like when I read Novalis' Hymns to the Night or something, it's like, they just think, but is there another kind of knowledge? Isn't another like sense or intuition or some other way we can plug into things we might not be able to objectify in knowledge, theoretical knowledge. But they still agree that theoretical knowledge is not viable, I think. Now, Hegel's going to make fun of both. He's going to say romantics just have their feeling, which is an empty intuition that has no content. But then the Kantian scientists, all they have is formal. All they have is content, but the content about that they have is not really about anything particularly important or that matters to the spirit. So what they want to do is have both. What Hegel wants to do is have both. He wants to bring it together, of course. Similarities would be, I think Maximus is standing at a time a lot different there as well, but he's standing at a time where it's like the stakes for getting Christ right has so much to do with whether or not we can even know God. Given the apophatic, the negative tradition, not only in theology, but also in philosophy and late antiquity, and where it ended up, which is you can't know. I mean, of course not. We might be able to participate through theurgy or something like that in the activities of the gods, but Iamblichus is clear that doesn't mean you're affecting the gods. It just means you're kind of being taken up by the emanations of their activities downward, as it were, and might lift you a little bit. Then you see a very interesting kind of like potential argument, even in late antiquity, against theoretical knowledge of God, and an emphasis instead on ritual, on sort of a unapprehended participation through material things and media, because that's the way you would, if you expect it all to know the one of the things the one has in common with matter is the perception that it's nothing. There's two kinds of nothing. There's the thing that has no form, and there's things above all form, but they look the same to you initially. And so material media, that's partly Iamblichus's argument based on the principles of Platonian philosophy. Even though Plotinus and Porphyry were against ritual, Iamblichus's genius is to take their very principles and turn it around and say, but shouldn't you expect this, actually, that this is where it's all going? And so he defends theurgy, and the Neoplatonists go that route from then on. Okay, so the point would be, you have that precedent even in Maximus's historical background. I don't know necessarily always the degree to which he knew directly Proclus or whatever, but he knew Dionysius. Dionysius knew Proclus, so I think there's an interesting question. I mean, it's like, there are ways to read Dionysius. Like in the end of mystical theology, whenever Dionysius says, even the Trinity is sort of something you just say and then discard. Well, what does that mean exactly? People defend it on, well, he doesn't mean like it doesn't matter or whatever. And okay, there's a whole discussion there you can have about images and symbols and how they work and all that. But you can see why, like, you've read Maximus now. I mean, you can see why he might be a little bit uncomfortable with some of that, right? Like, well, I mean, so is Jesus. Even Dionysius says Jesus isn't just human in the same sense that we say God causes humans. So we're breaking through to another logic anyway. I could go on and on. So I think the similarities are that they do have analogs in their historical context. The major difference, though, that I'll mention, and I'll stop because I've been going too long. You're letting me nerd out, which is a huge, huge mistake. I do think, unlike Maximus, just because he didn't have to face it, I do think the Kantian challenge is far, far more fundamental and persuasive than even like, Damascus is sort of the last gasp of a tradition that literally and institutionally is crumbling. He's brilliant. I don't think but Kant won an era. I mean, in Western history. I mean, that's not almost everyone is Kantian in some sense at some moment now, even if you're a postmodern, deconstructionist. And in fact, in a certain way, you're almost more Kantian if you're that. Psychoanalysis has indebtedness to Kant. Idealism indebtedness to Kant. Even modern apologetics is a lot Kantian, in my opinion. The criteria for truth. What counts as a successful argument in apologetics? Very Kantian, whether or not they universality, necessity, or all this stuff. So, and then I think the socio-political, connecting religion and religious thinking with the implications it has socio and politically, and the perils and dangers that lie there, which then have us sort of reticent about religion altogether. That's all very much where we are, man. I mean, that's where we are. This is the world. And so, in a certain way, the old bum at Königsberg who never left the city in his whole life or whatever, like, kind of won an entire part of the world for quite a long time. And so, I think Hegel sees that as the grave challenge it really is. And I also think he sees that you cannot simply deny Kant, but you have to show that even within a Kantian framework, there's some kind of immanent pathway beyond it that incorporates it. That's called sublation in his terms. And so the difference there, I do think, would be between that and Maximus is that whereas I think Maximus, there's a certain kind of dependence as well, still on like the authority of certain councils. The authority of the fathers and how they've understood this or that, whether or not the emperor thinks this or that. I think now and this is partly what it means to be modern. I just do think after Kant and a lot of other things that I'm skipping over, look, we're at a time where religious truth, for it to be quote unquote triumphant, has to appear as true to people. We no longer just say, yeah, well, so-and-so thinks it's good enough for me. I mean, some people do, of course, but like, that's the big thing about the Enlightenment is you have to see that it's true for yourself. It's a kind of call to grow up. Now, it can definitely go off the rails, and sometimes it can look almost more adolescent than growing up. It can be like a teenager that's just raging against everything, right? So I think sometimes you can turn it back on the enlightened ones and be like, aren't you you're enlightened like a teenager is in comparison to a child, but that doesn't mean you're an adult yet either. And I think Hegel is the adult. I think anyone that says, Kant's right about a lot of things, and Hegel's clear about that. It says, if you think you can just say things to me, at one point he says in the Lectures of Philosophy of Religion, if you think you can constantly just say to me, the infinite and the finite are not the same, that the eternal and the temporal are not the same. If you think you can just quote these opposite categories to me, as if the Kant's critiques had never been written, then you've woefully neglected your own education, blah blah blah. So. Yeah, and so the difference is that Hegel is doing what I think Maximus is doing for totally different reasons, but he's doing explicitly within a Kantian framework, a post-Kantian framework. But here's the point. Here's where I'll land. The thing is, given the content, the kind of Christology we've been talking about, that should be possible from any framework. If Christ is the whole truth in a way that isn't simply some abstract whole to a part or whatever logic prior to any event or act, it should be the case that Christ is in all things, and you can find the fullness of the content within any framework, precisely because there's no absolute foundation that isn't just Christ and not Christ as an idea, but Christ as a living person. You should be able to do that from almost any in any framework. The question is just to do it rightly and think thoroughly through that content from that framework. But the framework, can kind of come and go, I think. So Hegel's framework is post-Kantian idealism. And then, of course, the big move there is to say, Kant's categories, the antinomies, are themselves mute, even though he says they're opposites and irreconcilable. The very judgment rests on the fact that that those concepts are mutually entailing. And so how can something be totally opposite and therefore contradictory also be mutually entailing? The finite and the infinite come together. You don't perceive the eternal without time. So that's one way in, right? That's a way in. That's not, he doesn't go to like quote Chalcedon and then go about his way. But if the content of Chalcedon, as Maximus understands it, is true, you wouldn't need to do that always. See the point? There's no absolute sequence here. There's only the true logic itself, thought from within. But that doesn't mean you have to have an absolute starting point. And that's exactly why it can be the truth for every age. You throw up the starting point and we'll work with it and we'll still get there. That's the kind of real ambition there, I think, the real synthetic power of Maximus's approach as an exemplar. So anyway, I went way too much there. So cheers.
Part of my confusion, or where I remain often in my thoughts about those things you were saying at the end, I'm not up on Enlightenment philosophy per se, but are Hegel and Kant just considered Enlightenment philosophers? How does that relate to postmodern, and also this kind of discussion that's kind of buzzing now is, are we at the end of something we can't even see right now? Is the Enlightenment closing in on itself? What's next? And we don't know the answer to that, but we're thinking differently. So can we approach these questions in a way other than Enlightenment? Is that even possible? I think there's probably a debate that can be had over that, and that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, I mean, that initial question about whether or not Kant and Hegel Kant certainly is an Enlightenment philosopher, there's no question. But he's an interesting one. Like he's not like Voltaire. He's not even like Hume, who are just sort of destroying and, supporting a sort of skepticism. There is a kind of skepticism, but he's not an empiricist. He's explicitly against that. What Kant says, I don't know why this is, it's in my world. It's in the theology world. You get these totally warmed over takes on someone like Kant or Hegel or whatever, and it's just really tiresome to me. I'm not projecting this on any of you guys, but like, that's why you can probably hear in my voice a little exasperation, where it's like, Kant doesn't even make any, initially his project doesn't even have anything to do with making any metaphysical claims. His question is, how do you know that's true, whatever you're claiming? So it's not about the content of any metaphysics. It's about the possibility of all metaphysics. And so that's why he likens it in his preface to, he said, he begins the first critique by saying, if you look in mathematics, there's been all these advances since like Archimedes or whoever, and then if you look in the natural sciences already in his day, the empirical sciences, there's been massive, Copernicus, and all this, Galileo, all this, there's been a lot of advances in that. So already should be noticed and I don't want to make this into a whole class about Kant, but we may as well just say this. Notice the two kinds of science he's chosen. One is totally abstract, numbers, math, not empirical. The other one is absolutely empirical, astronomy, he talks about, right? Okay. And what he's saying is, but they've both advanced. So it can't be that it's just, well, if you do abstraction, you'll advance, or if you do empiricism, you'll advance. Somehow they're both advancing. Like we're getting out. So the question is, how's that possible? And why has metaphysics not basically advanced much beyond, in his opinion, like Aristotle? Okay, probably it could be a little more generous about how he reads the history there, but right? And so his thing is to actually, he's trying to save metaphysics by giving it a better, more sure method that matches, that can compete with the two different types of inquiry, empiricism or abstraction. It's just that the price of that at the end of the long argument is to cut out quite a lot that, like, especially religious people don't want to cut out, understandably. So Kant is an Enlightenment thinker, but he's not a mere skeptic. I don't know. I don't really see any reason to think he is insincere when he says I had to deny knowledge of certain things in order to make room for faith. I think he probably really believed that, and he really believed that's also practically the best thing that can happen at that part of the world. And now, post Europe falling apart and Christendom falling apart. To call Hegel an Enlightenment philosopher is a little bit more bizarre. I mean, he is in the sense that he's incorporating Kant in that whole tradition. But like, I've heard people say that about him, and by which they mean Hegel being an Enlightenment philosopher. It's like he's trying to subject, like, the great sin of the Enlightenment is in its pride to think its autonomous reason can master everything, all truth. And like, that's what Hegel's doing, according to that view. It's a very easy caricature. It's one you can quote a few passages here and there, and it sounds persuasive. The problem is it completely and totally neglects the question about the character of reason itself. Is there such thing as a totally autonomous, that is to say, non-divine reason in Hegel? No. Any more than there is in the Gospel of John. Where's the logos that's merely human, in the like cut off from God sense, right? So in order to like have, like, you could legitimately say about Diderot or Voltaire or Hume or whoever, or Hobbes or whoever, you could say, they separate the world from God, and they either deny God or they try to sort of take over God, like because you do have an autonomous reason in that sense, like a totally cut off, independent. But it's like, what do you say about someone like Hegel, who wants to appreciate that moment, that, like, why do we even perceive ourselves as being autonomous in that way? And what is that? But then that doesn't think ultimately that the reason in you is simply human and cut off. And so I don't know if I would say he's an Enlightenment thinker. I think he's dependent upon the Enlightenment as a moment and as a movement that he has to incorporate and address. But I don't think he's just Enlightenment thinker. But the last, probably more interesting part you mentioned was end of something. Are we at an end of something or not? I mean, notoriously these are hard things to know in the moment. But I guess it kind of does throw me back in mind, though, to the first week, right? It's like, I think we are at a crossroads of sorts, and I know it's another thing I can say easily, but I do think we're getting to a point where either some kind of creative synthesizing is possible, or else we're just going to kind of spiral into pure fragmentation.
Yes.
Because there's just no way to even, who can keep up with any of this? It's hard enough to keep up in your, whatever. Think about your greatest interest. What are you most interested in? Are you abreast of everything happening around those topics in one thing? I try to read, like, a physics book every fifth book I read. I try to read, poetry every day a little bit. I try to do, but I'm not a professor of literature. I don't know I don't know the newest poets. I can't name you modern poets that are huge. I don't know what the latest developments are in quantum physics, and I barely even can tell you what's the latest trends in modern philosophy, and that's closer to my so I do think there's this sense, and I've said this before. I once had a student who was like brutally honest at one point. It was really great. It was a seminar we were having. We're talking about, like, it was like a great books program. I think we were talking about, I don't know, the Iliad or something. Or no, we were talking about Augustine's Confessions. That's right. And, it was sort of it was about his friend dying in book 4 of the Confessions. And I'm trying to get him to talk about death and sort of, light stuff for a 20-year-old. And I'm bringing up questions like, is death good or bad? From the Christian perspective. On the one hand, it seems to be the enemy, like it says, and on the other hand, there's this kind of invitation to die, And this kid, eventually, I'm like getting nothing. It's like crickets. And I'm like, so you guys, like, no thoughts on this stuff? Like, I'm just kind of jazzing him a little bit. And this kid, I had a good relationship with him. He's like, look, it's all interesting, but what do we know about this? Like us, like students, like you studied like your whole life, and like, but like you don't even agree with like everyone, that you're in the same field with, or even colleagues or other faculty here, right? On some of this stuff. So like, I just think we kind of feel like, how are we gonna like add anything or no, like be able to get a handle on this stuff? And I actually thought like that's a really
Yeah.
insightful, honest moment, and
Yeah.
I think it's actually has broader resonance. Like a lot of people do that. They look at the scale of things, the magnitude. And I begin classes this way, in this class on modernity and belief and unbelief, where I'm like, I always say like, a century ago, we didn't even know there was more than the Milky Way galaxy. Now we see over 2 trillion galaxies. How many stars are in those, right? That's just one example. It doesn't talk about deep history, doesn't talk about the past, doesn't talk about other socio-political, ethical stuff that are hot button issues. And there is a sense of vertigo where it's like, I can't keep up with the expanding horizons of all this. And so that to me is a lot of the crossroads. It helps explain some of the anxiety and fear that even comes out in social political manifestations and interpersonal familial dynamics. There's a lot of fear because there's a lot of uncertainty, because there's a lot of how can we know all of it anyway? And where in the heck are we? And, Carl Sagan made the pale blue dot seem really nice, and then when I look around, I'm kind of terrified, you know. And so I think the question is this: do we have any potential for a creative, appropriately scaled synthesis and synthesizing, or is this just flying into oblivion?
Well, I think there's a natural resistance to synthesis for like a lot of people, and I think and part of that is that first of all, as you hinted and as we discussed actually I think last week too, it's like any active synthesis must ultimately be a personal synthesis. And
Right.
so people have a tendency to make things as simplified as possible and to reduce their anxiety. And undergoing the work of personal synthesis is ultimately rewarding, but it is anything but like and anxiety reducing as it's ongoing until you have reached the point of where those things have become synthesized. So there's a natural tendency to want to resist it. This is just talking about like synthesis, what we're doing right now. And just like this is what Tomberg says in Meditations on the Tarot on conversation. And he relates it to the act of synthesis.
I knew it was coming.
I couldn't not say it because it was so appropriate.
No, I'm counting on you. Go
Yeah.
for it.
Yeah. Now it is through the fusion of opinions that truth lights up. Conversation, the process of together versing, flowing together, is the very opposite of controversy. The process of controversing, flowing against. Conversation is the operation of the fusion of opinions. It is a work of synthesis. True conversation always has in principle the underlying statement from the gospel, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there am I in the midst of them.
Yeah, and this is the tough thing, right? Because then one thing we start to notice is that the search for truth isn't just the lone scientist in a lab somewhere recording data and making hypotheses. It's not just the classics guy or woman reading in the archives in some old dusty library. It also becomes a political thing. Because how is it that I'm going to get at the truth of the whole without everyone? And how am I going to do that? How am I going to do that with everyone if I'm constantly at absolute animosity with most or part or whatever, right? Well, that's also tough, and it kind of puts me in mind too of another horizon that I'll sometimes, because I do this like opening lecture in this class where it's like like a quick survey of the horizons that have expanded, say in like the last 100 years, just to put it like, what does it mean to be modern? I think that's nearer what it means to be modern, is to be cognizant of the expanding horizons and the magnitude, and then to attend to them. And that can take many forms: positive, negative, excited, ambitious, fearful, anxious, right? But another horizon is, and that Paul could talk to us at length about, is, I do think, like, psychoanalysis, like the uncovering of the soul and the dynamics that are fundamentally there. So it's like everywhere you go, internal, what's there? Layers upon layers upon layers upon layers. Stuff that I don't consciously decide, and that's yet dictates the way I think and react, and patterns I inculcate, etc. Right? You look at literally the stars; they're expanding, the universe expanding. We look where? Let's look at the scale of quanta. Oh my gosh, what's going on there? How does this go with gravity? Let's look at the scale of history. Well, I just looked yesterday. I was looking at these paintings from 12,600 years ago in the Amazon. These cliffs. But that's not even close to how far back hominids go. And then let's get to the Earth, and then literally every direction I go. What about religion, and theology? Well, even these 2,000 years, hopefully you got the sense, even reading Maximus in years, 7th century, a lot had happened since the New Testament, right? Lots to incorporate. We're not even in the Middle Ages yet, and then the early modern. And I've had more than one person express to me like it's just a lot, like there's just a lot to like everywhere you look. I'm just going to throw this in there and this one's for free. I'm going to throw this one for free. Okay, guys. I think this is partly why hell and the question of eschatology is so pressing in a way that it never was before. And because I get that question a lot. How could the church be so wrong or almost like negligent about these questions for so long, etc.? Even though I know there's some people throughout the history that but generally, how could look? We can basically only handle like one big thing at a time. Like, I don't know, personally, at least maybe you guys are super, but like even in your own life, like your own what you're talking about, Nate, with the personal synthesis and like dealing with your own stuff. Anybody that's even tried to do that in therapy or anything, like, you don't just go in and like, so lay it all out. Let's, all 51 things. Let's get, no, it's like, okay, one step, and it takes time and conversation, to your point, Tom Burke's point, conversation, it's this massaging, it's this sort of discovery. And I'm just like, given the fact that 2,000 years is nothing, I actually think we're getting to the hell thing pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's amazing that that's already actually right there on the horizon of like, what are we? But the point would be, the psychological point would be, one reason why it weighs on so many people is because as they look at the expanding horizons and they sort of start to lose their grip on everything, even within them, it's just harder and harder to make sense of, okay, so let me get this straight again. I got, at best, hopefully, if I'm lucky, 70, 80 years to figure out enough of the right stuff and the fundamental matters, or else the price is eternal, right? Conscious torment. Given the layers and the expanding horizons, that just becomes less and less viable to truly believe.
Right.
And so I don't think it's accidental that, as Charles Taylor has put it, there's a noticeable, quote, decline of hell, as he says, in secular age since the 19th century, at least. It's not a coincidence that's coinciding with exactly the exponential increase of the expansion of horizons in all directions in human inquiry and understanding. I don't think that's an accident. It's not something you can really prove like absolutely, because it's just too big of a thing. But like, I don't know. It seems more than just a little accidental. So
the last conversation I had with John Vervaeke, this is interesting because we were talking about his experience of like the spirit of Hermes as sort of like a sort of experience that he's had, where he feels that he has this feeling of like communicating with the spirit of Hermes and being guided by the spirit of Hermes. And I talked to him about that, and we ended up talking about the archetype of the hermit. Essentially, the entire conversation was about the work of synthesis. Like, that's what it was about. And one of the things that he kept encouraging me to like look at more closely is some of the more recent developments within the realm of psychotherapy, which directly connect to this whole notion of personal synthesis. And then the other thing I wanted to say is that, since you brought up the psychoanalytic thing, Tom Berg also has this great passage in Meditations on the Tarot where he's talking about the introduction of Jung's idea of the collective unconscious. And so memory is a really important theme throughout Meditations on the Tarot for Tom Berg. And so he says that collective unconscious represents like like in the realm of the psyche, a very similar thing to what archaeology is to the realm of geology and ancient biology. So what he says that he ends up relating the collective unconscious, Jung's idea of the collective subconscious, to the very principle of resurrection itself, because ultimately it opens up this promise that nothing will be lost because of the opening up of that idea. So
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's great. Solomon, I'm not sure if he's still there. I did want to read his question he wrote in the chat a while ago, 44 minutes ago. Okay, so he asks, in light of Maximus and the Eastern Church, obviously significant in the Philokalia, but how was Maximus engaged by Palamas and Palamite, showing radical deification, but also potentially qualification, depending on which count of move? I don't know. I don't have a good answer. I don't want to. Here's what I do know, and then I almost would be more interested in telling me some of your own hunches here. But Palamas definitely knew Maximus. He cites him, fairly frequently. I have never done a study though, and I don't know like which parts of Maximus. Can you trace what he's read or whatever? I don't know. I'm sure maybe you can, but. So I'll just say this, since I don't know sufficiently and I don't want to make stuff up. I think one of the nice things about Maximus, as I've come to understand it, and whether or not you think I'm on the mark or far off or whatever is a different question, I guess. But if it is even near the mark, is that I do think it allows us to revisit criteria for what's supposedly orthodox or not. But then also just try to revisit how to understand certain thinkers. Like one of the obvious ones we brought up here several times now, and that I just sort of happened upon was Hegel, for example. But I also think there's this question of more like nearer to the actual tradition that Maximus has been dear to, like Palamas. And, just as a real quick example, essence energies distinctions, right, is the great divide between, say, Thomas Aquinas and Palamas, even though there's been people try to argue that you can reconcile those. Essence and energy. Where's the persons? Like that's what I want to know. I want to know, like, yes, they're like, well, it's always in the hypothesized energy or activity and so forth. Okay, fine. But like again, let's think about Christology. How many essences did Jesus have according to Maximus? 2. How many energies or activities does he have? 2. How many person? 1. So if essence and energy are the logic by which we understand the whole world and its relation to God, I think we're already leaving out a crucial part of what I would call Christologic, and I wondered, now I'm not sure that's Palamas himself, though. That's more me speaking to a certain version of it, like through Lasky and stuff that I've heard. But we have to remember, too, Palamas is like mostly not translated into English. And I don't really get that. There's critical editions of all of his works. If there's obvious interest in it, he's obviously hugely important for the last 150 years at least of orthodoxy and way beyond, all the way back to his own day. So where are the translations of Palamas? And so I've got a friend who is wanting to maybe do that and asked me to participate in translating Palamas. And I'm like, I got other things to do for now. But if anyone else wants to take up the mantle, please do. But like we get like the triads, and the Western Classic series, but that's not the full triads. That's like maybe a third. So there's so much more there. And so I kind of think a broader reevaluation. I've never finished Tico and Pinot's book on Palamas, the recent one. And so I need to do that. So I wonder what he'll do, but he does come from a context under Plested and Marquette and stuff that are more interested in trying to bridge, I think, Palamas and Aquinas, which is laudable in itself in terms of ecumenical interest, but I'm not sure either side has really reckoned with Maximus, so we'll see. I don't know, though. What do you think, Solomon? Do you have any hunches from like just what you've read these 8 weeks and what you know of Palamas and his traditions?
Granted, I know remarkably little. I've really just read snippets of Palamas and more Maximus, granted, of course, in this class. And I suppose I'm not sure if this is a valid way to frame things, but it seems like lots of very similar intuitions are communicated by different distinctions throughout. All traditions, almost every religion in some sense. But a connection, I think, between Maximus and Palamas, like you can take the energy essence in what I don't know, in a more rigid, I don't know, modern
Right.
tone, or however you want to qualify that as a way of separation. But it almost seems like Palamas is wanting to allow for the most radical possible deification in the same way that Maximus wants to do the tantum quantum, fullest as full can get, but then also have a distinction between like, oh, we are not the hypostasis of God or the Trinity, and like so it keeps some distinction. It's just how that distinction is done, and if you try to cram all those different figures or symbols or however you want to name that, then it doesn't work. But if you're
Right.
taking almost in like they're trying to go towards the same thrust, it's almost more practical than it is specifically like a rigid logical system, at
Yeah.
least in one. That was kind of my intuition, but
I
we'll
think
see.
it's a good intuition. It's that same colleague that's been trying to coax me into yet another translation project. I'm kind of wanting to be done with translation projects for a while, but although I know they're very valuable, and in a lot of ways, it's like if more people read Maximus than whatever I write, that's good. So that's or Palamas or whoever, these major figures. But he's sending me snippets exactly along the lines you're just saying. It was like, look at this, what he just said. It's like extremely radical deification language stuff about the word being begotten, the son being begotten in and through our own souls, and this stuff that we saw already as something Maximus. And so I think it's a good intuition. The point about experiential though is really important. I think that is really, really important. I think that's an absolute convergence. Like you really can't deny that, so when Palamas is going after Akinidos or whoever, who's much more like Aristotelian in his kind of logical chops and very sharp and trying to make this argument out of a logical kind of anxious anxiety. It's very much what's leading with Palamas, as far as I understand, is this like, yeah, but we experience the uncreated light. So it's like, how do you now I think sometimes, and you probably would agree with this, like sometimes I don't like even with Maximus has been done, like I don't like the way the like mystic versus theologian thing gets played off against each other, or like this is a devotional writer whereas this one's like a treatise composer, who's like more philosophically dense, and there's just simply no way you can read Maximus and abide that kind of distinction. You guys know that. I mean, it's just no way. But I mean that in the full sense. Some of the work on like Maximus and philosophy, ancient philosophy, has been interesting, like Tollefson or these other authors that have written on Maximus and philosophy, or that one French guy always does it. Pascal Jourdain is his name, I think. It's all good, like, and some of it really is really important, but like sometimes you can walk away from that thinking more like, okay, so Maximus is just sort of like a dialectician, who's interesting. I don't know, but no, like he's very much foregrounded in the life and the practices and the mystical sort of dimension of spirituality. And yet that just simply doesn't mean he doesn't also, as is true, compose short commentaries on Porphyry's logical tree and the organon. I mean, it's just not a division. And so I wonder, here's the point. I still want, given that Palamas is still kind of hidden from a lot of even Western interested observers, what are we going to find if we really do kind of give the full corpus out there? Isn't going to be like a Maximus case, where it's like, yeah, all this stuff where it like helps your prayer life immediately got out first because it's more like useful to people immediately. But then like he's got this stuff over here that's super interesting on the Trinity or whatever. So I hope so. I just don't know if I want to give, 3 years of my life to that right now, but it's worth looking into for sure. So, but no, I don't have a very good answer for you. So,
That did slightly just this conversation reminds me that your fourth question in the week 8 questions, discussing that there's not two kinds of love. And if this is true, what does that do to our metaphysics? What might it mean for the ongoing debates over a relational but process theism God versus a really unrelated but classical theism God. And I like the way that's framed because I feel like so often there's, you know, any of those four parts, like I want to combine them in a very specific set that avoids, the process theism and the really unrelated element in a certain sense, at least, where it's so hard, even, I guess, and that's what synthesis does, and that's what I think Maximus and different folks in Palamas are trying to get at least, intuitionally, of being able to hold, and maybe it's just going back to what I said weeks ago about things being provisional, and maybe there's that element of where there needs to be humility in this, because like we don't want to not have any classical theism, because I mean I grew up in that, and I think that's just people wandering around in myth, and you need something more. But also I don't want to swing all the way over to the rigid Thomist side, or reformed, where things are just reduced to almost just immoral mathematics, it seems to me. But yeah, and how do you bridge that? And Maximus, I think I'm still trying to, wade through Maximus's own two natures, one hypothesis element for if that can be used. I don't know how to frame that, but I like that question. I like that giving those bounds in the way you framed it. Because I think that's helpful, showing both the positives and the negatives of the two kind of poles, I suppose.
Right, exactly. And isn't that, I mean, and the thing is, this is, of course, not a new debate, as you know. I mean, we could frame it in terms of the God of the Bible versus God of the philosophers, or Athens and Jerusalem, or, the Hellenism versus Judaism. This kind of like these tropes have been going on forever. Yet there's a real problem. Like there's a reason why that they're perennially they're recurring. Right? I think is that what I try to get in the framing of the question is that because they both do have something that seems to be absolutely necessary. It's very hard to make sense of faith and like this whole religion thing and the way. Yes, you can. Hey, you all know I'm like the first to like defend allegory and figurative readings of the Bible. I got no qualms about that, probably to the great consternation and anxiety of many other people. But like one thing you can't just jettison though is like God is interactive. I mean, it's like he is. I guess one way to put it is like, can I be an absolute object of God's love? Can he really want me? And what does it even mean to say that he really wants me? As you say, like like the classical theism side, the danger there is that in order to fix God and make sure he doesn't stoop to the depths of becoming a finite, passive, qualifiable creature, they will secure the immutability of that. It's like what I call the concept of the concept. They love the concept of a concept's not changing. It's so stable and sure and reliable. So the concept of the concept is that God, the concept of God, should be that which never can change and be affected in that kind of external way. Otherwise, he's just Zeus or Hermes or whatever in the like caricature, sort of the non-philosophical mystical understanding of that, just the characters on the page. But at the same time, it's like if God can't, and so in order to say God doesn't change, it almost sounds like you have to say God doesn't really want me. He happens to want me in this world order, but like you can't say he really, and by really they mean like essentially. Because then if he essentially wants, and want is a sign of lack, then I complete God's essence. And we can't have that because that would mean he's no longer God. So the good thing is they don't want God to just be finite. The price you pay is it's hard to see how he's really legitimately relational. So then the inverse here is just the process folks or whatever, like, well, no, we want him to be genuinely relational. We want your prayers to matter. We want God to give a shit about us, frankly. But the price you pay there is he might have to change and even be somehow dependent on that which he creates or is God of. And then so that's a process, right? I think personally, and you're not going to be surprised by this at this point, that is an antinomy, if there ever was one, in the true sense, like the authentic sense of both sides have something that actually is absolutely integral. And it's not clear how they can integrate. And that's the problem. And so we're going to take up sides and fight and try to hierarchize. This one's more important than that one. I'm willing to give up that for this, that kind of thing. And that's what we do over and over again. The only way I can see, and this would be a fun book to write someday, maybe it'll happen, probably won't. The only possible way to get out of this, so to speak, or not get out of it, really to transcend it, to synthesize in the true sense we've been talking about, is if you question the absoluteness of the sequence itself, which is integral to our thought and even raising the question and perceiving the antinomy. If somehow that can be transcended, then you don't have to choose. Is it possible to say, as Eriugenes sort of seems to suggest in his four divisions, as at least the way he explains them, that it is equally true to say that eternity is the achievement of time, what God through the process of time achieves, as it is to say that eternity is the condition for the process itself? Is the beginning really the end? Or is it being just sort of like the end, or are they sort of similar, or whatever? If they're exactly the same, as Maximus seems to be able to say through his Christological metaphysics, then you shouldn't have to choose between. Like, God has always and eternally already interacted with you such that you and your own freedom have contributed to the content of his eternity. But it doesn't mean his eternity was ever in jeopardy or in peril or in danger of changing or falling like a merely finite thing, because it's eternally achieved. And yet the achievement still has marks of the process by which it was achieved. How does that make sense? Isn't this just a bunch of like throwing things together that don't connect? And that I think, yes, it is probably that. It's probably just a way of expressing what we don't want to let go of without making it cohere, unless somehow through certain Christology and Christological moves that I want to promote, they can cohere at some level, at some certain level, in a way that I don't think right now that conversation is at all incorporating. That's the kind of weird thing to me about, like, sort of the Ryan Mullinses of the world and the there's a few others. I'm losing their names. I don't follow it too closely, but isn't that, I actually think a lot of the stuff he raises is like legitimately problematic for like classical theism. But it does feel to me that the positive case he'll make, or the adjustments he'll be willing to make for a neoclassical view, are more or less just taking up the opposite side of the antinomy. And I'm not sure that really addresses the fundamental problem.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.